All right, well, it's 2:03, and we were going to start at 2, so hopefully I'm sure a few more people will jump on as we get going, but I know Gilad has a lot of awesome information. It's going to take some time, so I don't want to wait too long for us to get started. But again, I'm Jennifer McDonald, Director of Engagement at Engage One-to-One. I'm joined today with Megan Smith, the Account Strategist at SocialFlow, and the VP of Research and Development at SocialFlow, Gilad Lotan. And he's actually joining us from Israel, so thank you very much to him for getting out of an awkward time zone and joining us online today. So hopefully we won't have any glitches. And thank you to all of you guys for taking an hour out of your day to join us. I really think this is a beneficial webinar, and you're going to get a lot out of it. And it definitely won't be a waste of your time. And just so everybody knows, I am recording this webinar, and it will be hosted on our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/engage1to1, where the last webinar that I did with Megan, where we focused on content in this best practices series for social media optimization, that is also already hosted there because we recorded that one as well. So I'll be sending that out to all of you in an email once I download the file and get it up on YouTube. To get started, I'm going to pass things over to Megan Smith and let her start the presentation, and then Gilad is going to take over. Just so you guys know, we have a hashtag for the webinar. It's #SMO webinar, and I have that in the chat box, which is in your GoToMeeting software. You should see it there. Also, I'm going to post a link to the blog post that we did as well as the other webinar so you can see the recording. And if you do have some questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and I'll try to get them answered as soon as I can. But you can also tweet any questions or tips that you learn using the hashtag #SMO webinar. So feel free to make this as interactive as you like, and hopefully you'll get a great or learn a lot of great information from the webinar. I know I'd love to hear your feedback, so you can tweet me after to let me know what you think. Okay, so Megan, here we go, and we can get started.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jen. I really do love doing these webinars with you, so thank you so much for producing these and organizing and getting this all together with us. As Jennifer had mentioned, we had done a webinar recently a few weeks ago where we talked specifically about optimization for content, building a content strategy, and following a content cycle. During that webinar, we realized that timing was a huge piece of optimization, and it was something that we wanted to dive deeper into. So today, here we go. We want to focus on timing specifically, and in that respect, we want to talk about what goes into figuring out the best time, so to speak. So what do we see? What data is available to us to help us determine the best time? How does information spread over time? Looking at specific audiences, how they fluctuate in activities throughout a given day or a week or a time period. Sometimes that's predictable. Sometimes these patterns are predictable, and sometimes they're really not. So how do we determine that best time to post to Facebook or post to Twitter? And so we'll talk specifically a little bit about how SocialFlow approaches that with our platform and the results that we have seen. I'm going to let our head of R&D, who's Gilad Lotan. He's very well versed in this and has a lot of stuff to share. He's really the expert, so I'm going to hand it over to him.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thanks guys for having us here. Let me just see. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so my name is Gilad, and I'm a data scientist at SocialFlow, and I spend a lot of my time analyzing data that we get from social media. One of the biggest data sources that we have is the Twitter public fire hose. That is effectively every every public message that's posted to Twitter. So that's a ton of data that we have to handle on a daily, just in a constant level. So as a data scientist at SocialFlow, a lot of what the team does is sort of get to understand the data, get to play with it and build all these modules and all this stuff that feeds into the app. That's sort of, we spend a lot of our time doing this, and there's exploration, like understanding all the accounts, data behind the accounts, and understanding how we can enhance the tool by using data in different ways. And then the other thing that we do constantly is sort of publish a lot of analyses and just blog posts about what's going on in the network. We'll go over some of these modules later when we get to the nitty-gritty. So I think it's clear to all of us, anyone that deals with social media and the shift that social media is bringing with it, it's not difficult now to publish content to the web, right? That's a solved problem. Nobody finds it hard to publish anything to the web. The actual difficult part is getting people's attention, right? You cannot request attention at a given time, and you cannot even expect it anymore, right? You have to constantly try to understand what these networked audiences that you're building up, what they're interested in, how they're active, when they're active, etc. And the interesting thing is we can use all this data that's being shared in these social spaces to almost craft these digital silhouettes of these audiences by looking at how they behave, where they behave, when they behave, what they talk about, who they talk to, what else they're interested in. Like we have all these like little breadcrumbs left over from all these interactions that happen in social spaces, and many of these interactions are public. So by sort of mining the publicly available data, we can almost put a face to our audiences. And the interesting thing is, I mean, historically we used to have these almost functions that we would use. We would say, okay, for a specific channel at a specific time, this is sort of the demographic that we expect to be looking, at the content, and then we could give a value to a certain point in time, right, to a certain time slot within a broadcast, within a television broadcast. But that's not relevant anymore. With the network nature of media, we cannot assume that there'll be, a specific point in time where, a certain demographic will be engaged or will be active, right? Sure, there might be certain events that drive specific people that we can predict, but it's much, much harder. Everything's much more fluid, right? There are all these different things that are feeding into this new sort of equation that we use to quantify, the value of these time slots, or how much engagement we think we'll get, or how many people we think we'll see in these slots of time. Things we look at is topicality, right? What are the topics that are being talked about, and then what are the topics that interest people? Network. What are people's position in the network? Are they a central node? Are they an outlier? We talk a lot about timing. We talk about influence and authority. Who's an authority in a certain field? Trust and engagement. So I'm going to start by showing some of the data just to give you a sense for the kind of stuff that we see in the network. So this is an example of just a daily grab of comparing 4 different words. This plots out the amount of tweets, of posts that had each of these words over time. And what you see at the bottom is sort of days of the week. So 0, -1, -2, that's days from today, right? We're going backwards in time. So we see these really large spikes for morning, right? And it's pretty obvious. People talk about morning in the morning. So every morning there's a peak for the red line. We see tired, on the other hand, towards the end of the day, right? So this is the light blue color. We see it peak every end of day. We see coffee with a little peak in the morning, and then Starbucks is pretty constant. There's just a bit of a push every day. But it doesn't compare to the level of conversation that people are having about morning. So this is not groundbreaking. I know we're not like learning anything incredible here, but it's amazing that this data that we have access to, this public data, really reflects us, our humanity, and our daily routines, right? And we can easily access these kinds of things. Here's another pretty simple grab. These are 3 different ways to say the word morning. And again, you see the word morning, which is used in English. So this is sort of Australia, mostly Australia, United Kingdom, and the majority, in the U.S. when you think about Twitter users, we see this massive peak when the U.S. time zones sort of happen, right? And then the word morgen in German, we see that peak during the time zone when Germany is sort of has its morning, and then the word for morning in Indonesia, and we see that peak, right? So we definitely see activity happening between different countries for different time zones, and this makes total sense. Here's another data point. Here we compare the word party in green to beer and a hangover. And party, obviously party grows towards the weekend, and yes, it makes sense. Friday, Saturday night, many more people talk about going to a party or being at a party in the evening. I bet you can all guess what is Saturday night and which one is Friday night. You can see sort of the massive spike in party on Sunday. This is in the morning when people wake up and they talk about last night's party. And beer is actually pretty consistent, which is kind of surprising. Throughout the week we see same levels of people talking about beer. But hangover, note these little blue spikes on both Saturday morning and Sunday morning when people wake up with a hangover and talk about a hangover. So here's another spike, and this is probably more significant. So what we're seeing here are comparisons of different languages, right? So this is content published in English for green versus Spanish versus Japanese. So again, we see these diurnal patterns, these daily patterns happen where there's a rise during the day and then a fall at night. And Japanese content is probably almost the opposite peak as English content, and that totally makes sense based on the time zones. Note that the Spanish curve is slightly wider, and that's due to the fact that the geographic span of countries that speak Spanish in the world is much wider. And note this massive spike towards the left, the green spike. So see that it's significant, like it's much, much higher than other peaks throughout the week. And when we actually dive into this spike, we identify that it's a game that happened. It's 49ers against the Saints. And when we actually go into the spike, we see that it has its own shape, right? So this is what a sports game tends to look like on the network, and this is how we see the data. We usually see this ramp up towards the start of the game, and then sort of the excitement goes down, and there are certain spikes when certain events happen, and then massive excitement towards the end, right? So we can not only start to identify deviations from the norm, like we can see when there are certain massive spikes that happen, because we know what's the norm for the network. We can also start guessing what's most likely the event that's taking place, right? Just based on its shape. This is without even looking at the words that people are sharing. So it's pretty powerful. Once we get a better sense for this type of data, we can not only sort of identify these events and these specific events that happen in the network, we can also make pretty good guesses at what they are. Here's an example of 3 different types of events. So we see in blue, we see Marcha Anti-EPN, which was a huge march that took place in Mexico. And we see this organic rise and then slow decline. Lots of people protesting in the streets, right? On the other hand, we see True Blood in red. This is the opening of the season. Lots of excitement, build up towards the actual show, spike, and then decline. And then we see the Tonys, an award ceremony. And the Tonys, it's super clear. Just from looking at the shape, we see these a few spikes happen during the ceremony, and that's when certain awards are announced, and there's lots of excitement. Right? So again, each event that's happening, that sort of audiences coalesce around, we can see these shapes, and just this is without even looking at content, we can make pretty good guesses at what they are. So once we start looking at content, we can do even more powerful things. we can start figuring out words that appear next to other words and really try to understand the landscape of the language that people are using. For example, here we compare, this we did like half a year ago, we compare Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney, and we compare sort of hashtags, all the hashtags that are used in relation to either one of them or both. And when we graph this out and map it out, we actually create this landscape that represents people's perception of these candidates. So we can see, based on where the hashtags land, if they're closer to Mitt Romney, that means they were used more in relation to Mitt Romney, like #Obama, for example, because lots of people were anticipating that Mitt Romney would come up against Obama. Versus Newt Gingrich, which had a lot of conversation around Palestine and Occupy Wall Street. And note that certain terms which are sort of generic and used with both, like Republican, Democrats, economics, they appear in the middle because they were sort of evenly used with both. So we can start to get a better sense. Like we know what a certain event looks like in the network. We identify deviations from the norms. We try to make a guess at what this event is, and we can start to map out the language around the event. Right? What are the words that are being used around this event, and what are typical words used in these types of events, and how do they differ in relation to other events? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the shape of audiences, because a lot of what we do is really try to understand audiences. Like I said in the beginning, we try to almost sculpt a digital silhouette of these audiences. Right? So what does it mean to actually be able to see them, right? And to see these audiences as they behave online and see what excites them and when they're almost like quote unquote sleeping. This is a very simple plot of 3 different audiences on Twitter. In blue we see Pepsi, in green we see the AP, and in red we see Al Jazeera English. And here this is not mentions or references or engagement. All this is audience activity. So people who follow Al Jazeera English are tweeting or are not tweeting, right? And what we see, what the curve represents, is the volume of their tweeting, right? How much do they tweet at that time of day? And we see, again, these very familiar diurnal patterns. We see this a lot in social media, right? There's a peak during the day, and then it dies at night. But here, note that, for example, Al Jazeera English has a much wider curve, right? Because its audience, it's people who follow Al Jazeera English are probably more spread out than the other 2 accounts. So a lot of them are in the Middle East and Europe as well as North America, right? Pepsi and the DAP have sort of quite similar width. But note for example, we see here a spike in Pepsi's audiences. And this is actually due to a promotion that Pepsi put out. So we identified the spike, and then we can go dive into the data and see, oh, why is there a spike here? What are all these people reposting? And off to the right, you'll see a spike in all 3 audiences. And this is actually, when you dive into the data, you see that there was a breaking news event that happened, and in this case, it was Whitney Houston's death that was announced. Right, so all audiences spiked at that moment, reposting and discussing Whitney Houston's death. Right, so it's pretty powerful, even just being able to see this activity. So when your audience is active, being able to know what is the normal level of activity. And then when there are deviations from the norm, that's incredibly important for anyone who wants to deal with online sort of networked audiences. This is a different view of different audiences. This one is The Guardian, and what we see here is a network map of all these conversations, all conversations that were happening amongst the Guardian followers at a certain point in time. So this is 8 a.m. UTC on a certain day. I think it was Easter weekend. And we can generate these maps of all these concepts that people are posting, all these terms, phrases, entities, names, hashtags, like all these things that people are saying. And in this case, it's people who follow The Guardian. So they might not be connected within themselves. The only thing all these people have in common is that at one point in time, they chose to follow The Guardian. So it's very, very, very loosely connected, right? Especially on Twitter. But what we see is that even though they're loosely connected, people still coalesce around these events that are happening. So in this case, at 8 a.m., there was a lot of conversation around Easter. Right, lots of people excited that Easter is coming, London, and you could see that cluster there. And then at the bottom, you see this other cluster discussing the Middle East. And that weekend, there were events that were happening in Bahrain, protests. There's stuff happening in Egypt, and a bunch of people posting related hashtags and related content. Right, so those were sort of the two big topics that were being discussed by The Guardian's audience at this point in time. If we move to midday to 2 p.m., we see the picture is very different, right? So we still see the Easter cluster there. We see the Bahrain cluster. It's gotten a little bigger. But off to the right, notice the really dense topical cluster that appeared. And this is the Thames boat race, right? There was a boat race that happens on Easter weekend in London, I think every year, and that generated lots of excitement, lots of people talking about that, right? So you see that topic sort of take pretty much centrality for this audience at this point in time. When we move to the evening, the landscape is quite different, even though we still have these topics that lasted throughout the day. So we have Easter still there. We still have Bahrain. It's even bigger now. It spanned out to multiple clusters. There's a Syria and Egypt cluster. And then we see something we didn't see before. We see these memes and entertainment. Right? There's probably shows on TV that people are responding to. There's a sports cluster, and people are talking about games that are happening. Right? So this is a very different landscape of the conversations that are happening. And what's interesting with the access to data that we have now is that we can see and track these topics in real time as they're changing. Right? So here you get these snapshots. You got 8 a.m., 2 p.m., and 8 p.m. But what we're doing is constantly looking at these as they evolve. This is an example of an analysis we did to look at the spread of the Stop Coney video a few months ago. I'm sure all of you saw that video, or you probably got it on Facebook from a friend, from your children, right? It's the most viral piece of media that we've ever seen on the internet, and it spread like wildfire, right? So I think it was something like 100 million views within a few days, right? We've never seen anything like that. And the research team at SocialFlow, we were really interested to understand, first of all, how it spread so far, and if there's anything that we can learn from this network, this audience, or this group of people who initially spread the video. And when we mapped out the initial sort of network, so these are the first 20,000 or so people who posted to the hashtag or posted the video on Twitter, and if we map these out and if we cluster them, by clustering, I mean just sort of if we arrange the graph by people who are heavily connected to each other, right? They each follow each other. We see these sort of dense groups appear, right? It's very clear from this image. There's this big group on the right, top right, big group at the bottom, and all these sort of medium-sized and smaller groups. And this means these are people who are heavily following each other. Right? It's groups of friends or it's communities, but it's just people who are following each other at much higher rates than anybody else in this graph. And when we actually dive into the data and dive into these profiles, we could see similarities within these clusters. So for the top one, on the top center cluster, it was evident that the majority of folks who were in that cluster had in their profile something referencing Birmingham, Alabama, right? They were from different schools around Birmingham, Alabama. The bottom larger cluster was Pittsburgh, right? There was Englewood and Dayton in Ohio, Noblesville, Indiana, Oklahoma City, right? We saw all these densely connected clusters emerge from people who were following each other and posted this Stop Coney hashtag very early on. And what was interesting about this finding is that before we when we published a piece, a pretty long analysis on our blog that you should read if this interests you, but what was interesting for many folks studying media about this phenomenon is that media and sort of the public perception before we put this blog post out was that the video sort of went viral, right? As they say, it sort of was placed online and it was a pretty good video. It touched people and they shared it. And yes, it was pretty high quality and people sort of felt some emotional connection to the content and decided to post it. But when you actually see the initial network of people posting it, it was already set in place, right? The video didn't just spread by itself, but it was carefully orchestrated by these groups who were already supporting invisible children, right? So we already had this network in place. They all decided to post it at the same time, right? Decided this morning we're all going to post this hashtag. It trended in many different locations around the United States and then around the world. But it also sort of the fact that the network lit up from all these different locations at the same time helped the content be much more visible and helped to trend in all these different locations, right? So the fact that there was this pre-existing network accelerated the spread of this video in ways that it probably would not have been possible had it not existed, right? So it's just important to know that just by looking at data and by analyzing, we can actually also extract not only the type of data and the conversations that are being shared, but also what network is sharing it and how this network is organized. I hope I'm not going too fast, but I think we'll have some time for questions in the last 15 to 10 minutes, so bear with me. I'm going to talk a little bit about information flows, because a lot of what we do is really try to understand how things spread, how content spreads online. This is an example of an analysis that we did last year of the Osama bin Laden raid. Right, so I don't know if you remember, it happened, or the announcement came late Sunday night, and Monday morning the big headlines, or the big headline in video is that Twitter broke the news. Right? Everyone was sort of going off about the fact that people knew on Twitter before the presidential announcement Sunday night. And this is really interesting for us. We wanted to understand what exactly happened. And this is a visualization of the network, and we'll dive into, we'll understand it in a second. So by going into the data, diving into the data, we could identify a point in time. This is 9 p.m. at the top. You'll see this graph which shows search for two different keywords. One Osama bin Laden, the other Muammar Gaddafi. And at 9 p.m. that evening on Sunday, there was the announcement that came that there would be an announcement around 11 p.m., a presidential announcement. And this prompted people to start chatting online. Right? People are saying, wait, it's Sunday night. Why can't this wait until tomorrow? This has to be super, super important. So obviously, use social networks for what they're good for, spread rumors. So lots of people starting to say, hey, I think it must be huge. We probably have bin Laden, or we have Gaddafi, or something like that. Lots of people were actually posting that. But as you see, between 9 and 10 p.m., the level of usage of these terms was almost the same. And there's a certain point in time around 10 p.m. when Osama bin Laden really starts picking up. You see that blue curve rise. And what we see, when we actually look at the data, we could pinpoint that to this specific tweet posted by Keith Urban. And it went, so I'm told by a reputable person, they've killed Osama bin Laden, hot damn. Right? So Keith Urban, who used to be Donald Rumsfeld's chief of staff, posted this At that point in time, he had probably 700 followers. He wasn't a heavy user of Twitter. He didn't have a big network. But something about his posts made it go totally and utterly viral. Right? It spread like wildfire. Within a minute, there were 800. There were a few hundred people reposting it. Within 2 minutes, it was 800, and then thousands and thousands of people. Right? So we actually tracked that specific tweet, and what you see here is a network visualization of the spread of this specific message. On the top left, you see Keith Urban, sort of this large blue node, and all the retweets it spawned. What you see in the middle is a tweet by Jake Sherman, who wrote Rumsfeld chief Keith Urban says he's told bin Laden is dead, right? Contextualizing who this person is and why this piece of information might be valid, right? And then this is within like 2 minutes, right? This is all happening super, super fast. So Keith Urban posts the tweet. Within a minute, Jake Sherman has this question on Twitter, and then even by the end of that minute, Brian Stelter has already posted this. So this is Brian Stelter of the New York Times. He writes, Chief of Staff for former Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. He tweets, I'm told they've killed Osama bin Laden. Right, so contextualizing the tweet coming from this person who has sort of less authority on the network, recontextualized by someone who has authority, and then spreads like wildfire. Right, so part of the interesting thing about, so there are a few interesting things about this spread, but one is the fact that even the smartest machine learning algorithm could not have predicted the fact that Keith Urban's tweet would have spread this far. Right, he wasn't sort of an authority online. He was definitely an authority offline, but that wasn't reflected online, right, for his profile. And then this recontextualization and sort of helping generate trust in the network, the fact that both Jake Sherman and Brian Stelter are saying, hey, we think we trust this person, this is probably valid, right? And then thirdly, timing. I mean, the network was so ready for this piece of content because there were so many people looking for clues as to what was going on. So I think I just said this. I just said this in the conclusion of the story, but a big part of the fact that this tweet actually spread the way it did was the fact that they could garner enough trust from their network at that point in time. Here's another example of breaking news content. This one posted by Washington Post, and here what's interesting is what we can do, like the types of analyses that we can do by watching how something spreads. So for example here, the Washington Post were the first to report that prosecutor was planning to charge Zimmerman, right, in the Trayvon Martin death case. Right, so this is just a standard network diagram. Washington Post, sort of pretty big node. The news came from the Washington Post, and then there's breaking news, the handle on Twitter that generates lots of reposts, a few other quite large nodes. But what's interesting when we take the same data set and slice and dice it differently, we can get a better understanding of who's connected to who. So what this diagram shows, it's the same exact sort of nodes, but it shows who's following who. So the more yellow a node is, if a node is yellow, it means they only follow the Washington Post. If they're sort of this beigey color, they follow both accounts, and if they're blue, they follow breaking news. And what's interesting here is we can see this intersection. Oh, gray is also, it means they follow both. We see this intersection of networks happen, and we can actually identify for every information flow who of the people who reposted this post to the network are already in the network, the existing network of Washington Post, and who are new, right? Who do not follow them. You can take this a few steps forward. You could say, have they reposted their content in the past, right? As you define what your audience is. Is it people who follow you, or is it people who interact with you? Is it people who maybe have interacted with you in the past, right? So there's a lot that you could do by understanding a flow and then getting a better understanding of where everyone is situated in the network. Here's a third example of a flow. And what you see here is a network graph lighting up. This is the spread of a hashtag. And this is pretty standard. We see sort of the initial yellow node light up. This is the original poster of the hashtag. And we see the spread. We see all these sort of denser regions in the network. Each node represents a user, and connection represents who led to who, right? So who sort of saw the hashtag and then reposted it. And what we learned from this network diagram is, yes, there's a lot of density around Jake Tapper. He's sort of a known, he's a known authority on Twitter. He's got sort of a fairly large audience, but it's really hard to understand what's going on just by looking at this. So if we take the same data set and look at it in a different way, we see these nodes light up as they're posting the hashtag, right? So we see it start kind of slow, and then you'll see that there's that point in time where it really, really takes off, right? It slides really fast. And again, that point is identified with the same point that we saw at the top left in the previous slide. That's Jake Tapper. Once he posts the hashtag, it sort of goes, it sort of passes this mini tipping point, right? Lots of people join in, and then it slowly dies down. Now, if we see the data a third way, this is actually my favorite, we learn something differently. So here, the network is organized by social distance, right? So to the left is the original person who posted the hashtag. The second column are people who follow that person. The third are people who received the content from the second, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll see the majority of people lie in the second to third sort of columns, right? The second to third social hops. But note this node in the second column. It's a node called Lizzie O'Reilly. And what's interesting, when you dive into the data, you actually see that this node actually served as a type of bridge between the original hashtag poster and the sort of larger nodes, or what we would call authorities or influencers, which are Jake Tapper, ABC Dude, Kevin Madden, etc. Right? So we have these larger nodes who sort of help heavily accelerate the flow of the hashtag. Without them, we wouldn't see it spread. But we also see this really important person in the middle, effectively this bridge, who was, in this case, is the only reason this piece of information spread. Right? So a lot of what we think about is sort of understanding these flows, not only identifying who's a massive node in the network, because that's pretty easy. We know who has authority in the network. We know who has a large audience on certain topics, who's an authority. Like, that's not a hard question to answer. What's actually harder is to understand these flows and to see how things spread and who are the connectors, who are the bridges that help, these new ideas connect to people with audiences, right? And that's where this networked information is really, really powerful. Here's another screenshot of that network. So lastly, I wanna just go over the ways in which sort of different modules that we have and what we use to help surface interesting things about audiences and effectively understanding audiences. We look at a lot of the things that I presented, sort of the visualizations I presented before. We don't show these crazy network graphs in the interface because it's a little hard to actually understand without explanation. But we try to boil down the data in really simple ways, in ways that are actionable. So, for example, the heat map, the audience engagement heat map that you see at the top right, shows you when your followers are most active. So when people sort of click on your content, what time of day they mention you or retweet you, right? So in aggregate, we can generate these heat maps that tell you these times of days, and it's constantly changing, right? It's not something that's static. We'll never tell you, oh, at 1 p.m. on Wednesday. In this case, yeah, 1 p.m. on Wednesday had a lot of activity, but that doesn't mean that's always the time, right? Another thing that we have in the center here is active audience. So in this case, it's Engage 121's profile, and we see the numbers basically saying, there's 173 people from your audience who were active in the last hour, right? We can count this. We can see this, and we get these numbers in pretty accurate in real time, right? We can tell you right now in the last hour how many people were active. We also calculate this what we call audience trends, and this is a list of topics that your followers are talking about. So I don't know any other site that does this, because it's actually quite hard to keep tabs on everyone who follows you and then really extract all the things that they're talking about. But what we do is we sort of generate this list that constantly updates, and we try to understand what are the most prominent hashtags being used by your followers, who's most mentioned, and then if there are any specific phrases that are being used or topics that are being used. Here's another view. Below is another view that we're playing with when we look at trends. So this is one of our accounts, and this is looking at a week of audience trends. So what are your followers talking about, but mapped out throughout the week? And we can see that there's, for this specific account, there's a massive rise in talk about Obama and GOP, and Romney obviously leading to the debates. And there's some significant peak with regards to Bahrain in the middle of the week, but that died down, right? So we can see these, and we can map these over time, and we can really, for every audience, we can sort of see what are the trends and then how they change over time. Here's another way. It's just sort of zooming into these interfaces. So again, you have different views. You can see you can compare these concepts that represent topics that the audience talks about. Here's another view of an account, and what's interesting here, I think, is this is a tweet report, and the way that this helps understand your audience is per tweet you can see who reposted your tweet. So for every information flow, who participated in that flow, but you can also see where the clicks came from, where in the world they came from. So on the left we have, we see on the map that this post really lit up the United Kingdom and Ireland, and it makes sense because it's about, the actual post is in-depth Celtic message to Palestine, right? So obviously Celtic region lights up. And then to the right we see a post that mostly lit up the East Coast, the United States, some California, and different regions of the world, right? So very different places light up. Think of looking at this type of data over time and over different topics. You can start creating these maps, these heat maps of topics, and where audiences, where in the world certain topics light up, right? Your audience. So one thing that we do, we have access to like this really interesting data set, and we can start to understand, okay, your audience in the East Coast is much more engages with the political content that you post, but your audience in the West Coast is much more interested in entertainment. So you can start to figure out when to post certain types of content in relation to East Coast time versus West Coast time. So just to go over quickly some of the major concepts that we talked about, and then I'll hand over to Megan and we'll open it up for questions. We talked about understanding your audiences, what type of people follow you, how they're connected, where in the world they are, and really understanding this alignment between content and audience, what they talk about, and how that aligns with what you have to say. right? And a lot of this is possible now with data, public data that we have access to. Just don't look at vanity metrics too seriously. Like, more followers doesn't necessarily mean more engagement. I think that point is pretty clear to many folks working in the space now. Importance of real-time information, right? I know, I mean, lots of people are talking about real-time, but think of it as like, before you cross the street, you look left and right, because that's the most important information for the decision that you have to make. I think of it much similarly, right? Before you're about to post something, just get a sense for what's going on in the network, so you don't make a mistake, or so that you can sort of tighten up your language and make it more relevant to what's going on. We talked about bridges versus influencers, right? Don't only think about getting to the influencers, but also understanding how things spread and who are the important bridges. They're much more important than these bigger nodes. And then building up the right type of network for things to spread. So like we saw in the Bin Laden tweet and that spread, it's a lot of things that help content spread is gaining trust from an audience, having the right type of audience that's interested in the content that you have. So here I'll pass it over to Megan.
Sure. Alrighty, I also want to quickly summarize sort of the big question here, when the best time is to post. Just sort of recapping what we've talked about too. Really our philosophy is about posting, when interest intersects availability. So that's sort of the tagline, when the audience is there, but when they're also coalesced around a specific topic that you can relate to and that your content matches with, so that you have the highest chance for conversion, and that means engagement, clicks, retweets, shares, likes. Sorry, I'm just going back into slideshow view. Keeps wanting to skip to the front. Skip through this here.
Okay,
sorry, I'm resetting here. Seemed like every time I try to bring it up, it just wanted to go to the front. Okay. And so the more you know and understand your audience, the more accurate you can be about when to post. So it's not going to be, like Gilad said, it's not going to be 1 p.m. every Wednesday. One Wednesday at 1 p.m. might be really great, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same every week. And knowing when your audience is online and what they're talking about is going to give you the best results. So far, taking this approach, our clients have seen some really good results. These are just a couple of examples, and I know Jen has some to share as well. The Economist saw 5 times the referral traffic and 290% increase in clicks per tweet. So that's a really good engagement metric. Not only are the total clicks going up, but the clicks per tweet, actual posts, people are more interested in. Leonard Skinner, totally different client, music client, not like The Economist at all, still saw really good results with a 57% increase in retweets, and they gained 90,000 new Facebook fans in 16 weeks. And that was really working with us to come up with a content strategy and piling that together with the right time, and we saw some great results. Jen?
Sure. So, Megan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Just making sure. So just for everybody knows, we offered Social Flow for free in Engage One-to-One for over 50 of our clients. We offered it for all of our clients, but over 50 participated in the free trial. It was from May 1st to July 31st. And we were able to increase retweets for our clients by 944%. And I know that's a very big number, so I'm going to break it down for you. And it is an honest number because I myself did this report, and I pulled all the numbers. So this is accurate information. Our test size, we had about 8,200 tweets in that 90-day period. Before we started optimizing our tweets with Social Flow, we were getting about 11 retweets per every 100 tweets sent through the application for our clients. Once we integrated optimizing our tweets through Social Flow, the retweets increased to 150 retweets for every 100 tweets that were sent through Social Flow in Engage One-to-One, which is a really big increase. For one example, one of my clients they were using both options in the trial period. They were sending some tweets without optimizing them, and they were optimizing some. They only sent about 20 more tweets through optimization than they didn't, and their retweets increased 4 times by like a 4-fold. So they have 4 times as many retweets in that trial period by only sending 20 more tweets through optimization. So it's a really powerful to know when your audience is online, and again, for a human to write down all that data and constantly figure it out, and it's just impossible. So SocialFlow does that for us, as Gilad showed us with all his metrics and all his algorithms. So it's really great to have them on for us. It's almost 3, so that's my basic information. I want to get through it quickly. If you guys have any questions, you can enter it in the chat box in the GoToMeeting software. People are also tweeting. If you want to tweet with a hashtag #SMOwebinar, and we will answer them. I can even stick around till after 3 if anybody wants to stay on. So feel free to enter any questions, and we will hopefully provide you with whatever answers you need. I'm going to look at the hashtag here real quick. Gilad, here's one question. If the question is, if I have a Twitter account and I don't have a lot of followers, would I benefit from optimizing my tweets through your application?
Yeah, so the thing is, if you have content, what we do is we help figure out the best time to publish this content. And even if you have a relatively smaller audience, we can do this. So you actually gain more than not doing it. But I'd recommend if you're trying, also if you're trying to grow your audience, like it's really about understanding where you fit in and what type of content you're offering, right? So where your offering is, mentioning lots of people, tends to help. It gets your name out there. Having actually discussions too, and responding to things that people are already interacting with. But yeah, definitely. By understanding when people are online, you can probably do a much better job. And it's not only about, I mean, there's a bunch of other things that you can gain, like just seeing the analytics and really understanding where the clicks are coming from, what the trends are, and really sort of having your hand on the pulse there.
Okay, great. I have another question, and Megan, I think you can answer this one. So you predict when my tweet will be most effective, but do you guys help predict if how well my tweet is going to resonate? And I think that they're talking about your resonance meter. I know that Gilad didn't get into that in the software. But Megan, if you want to talk about the resonance meter that's built into the SocialFlow application, that might be very helpful for people.
Sure. So, and Gilad, you can also jump in. With the resonance prediction meter, we're looking at the previous tweets and Facebook posts, breaking down the keywords that are performing well for you and helping you write copy that resonates with your audience based on what's performed well in the past. So not only are we looking at how much of your audience is online and what they're talking about, but when you go to compose a tweet or a Facebook post, is this going to resonate with them? Is it are these words going to affect them, make them want to click more than other words, for example? Does that pretty much explain it, Gilad, or did?
Yeah. I mean, that's great. So we build these models that represent words that were successful for you in the past, and that represents sort of the topic space that your audience has been interested in the past. So it's actually a really powerful tool that helps you sort of understand that as you're writing these tweets. So that's another like huge plus to use the tool, even if you don't have a large audience.
Yeah, and I can talk about that a little bit since SocialFlow is integrated into Engage One-to-One. To give a little more of a visual representation, when you're actually composing your tweet in Engage One-to-One, and you select to have it through SocialFlow, and your account is authorized to use SocialFlow, you will see once you type it and you hit save, once you've determined what you want to tweet, The resonance meter is a little arrow, and it goes from red to green, and it will go up and down the scale on how relevant your tweet will be with your audience. So if it's really great keywords that are relevant to what your audience is talking about at that time, your arrow is going to go into the green. But if it's a tweet that doesn't have keywords that are relevant at the time or doesn't really have a lot of information that somebody's going to want to click on your tweets, not very descriptive, your arrow is going to go into the red. And so you can constantly edit your tweet and keep saving it to see how it does, just to help you get better at forming your tweets for your audience. It's really a great addition to their tool. All right, well, it's 2:58, so I don't have any more questions in the chat box. So as long as Megan and Gilad, you guys are good to go, I think we can end the webinar. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Again, you can search the hashtag #SMO webinar. This webinar was recorded. It will be hosted on the Engage One-to-One YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/engage1to1. And the last webinar I did with Megan is hosted there currently. I will email all of the attendees a link to the webinar as soon as it's ready to be accessible. And I just want to say thanks again and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.